One, as a columnist for ESPN, the magazine, I didn't get a lot of space. I mean, every writer wants to write as much as they can. And so each of my columns in the back of the magazine was only 750 words. And there were so many opportunities where I wanted to say something and I ran out of space. And so I started thinking maybe there was a book opportunity here to take some of these ideas and branch out and stretch them out further. Also, with the book that I did previous to this in 2018, The Heritage, Black Athletes, Divided America and the Politics of Patriotism, that book I had thought that was going to be more essay-ish, but as I started to work on it and as things were happening in the world, it was just very clear that I just really could not, there was just no way that you could do essays with that book. I got into chapter 2 of that book, and there's nothing worse than being in the middle of a book going, I hate this book, it's not very good. I started to realize that I needed to do way more research. I had to do way more history. I thought that there were too many things that I was letting go past. And so the essays had to wait. And I thought that book required a bit more research and a bit more explication.
All right, awesome. So this book, Full Dissidence, it came out, before the protests started in late May with George Floyd in the wake of his murder. Do you think that the protests have changed anything? We've been, I know myself and Leonard, we've been, kind of glued and, to just all the news stations regarding all the protests and everything that's going on. So in your first chapter, you spoke of the power of protest. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
Sure, absolutely. I felt like the book came out 20 years ago. That's how things have changed so much. It came out in January. Obviously, we had no idea what the year was going to be when the book came out. The real point of that chapter, especially what Colin Kaepernick taught us, was it was really a chance to discover my own evolving thinking. I think when I got done with The Heritage, at the end of The Heritage, the book, the chapter really ended the question with what happens when the athlete becomes the power, and what happens when you are, we've been talking about this athlete voice for years now, almost 10 years after Trayvon Martin with the Miami Heat and the hoodies, and then the Ferguson and Eric Garner in 2014, and then Colin Kaepernick's protest in 2016. And so this conversation about athlete activism and athlete protest and athlete power had really been on my mind, obviously. And then by the end of The Heritage and then the start of writing Full Dissidence, I started to ask another question. And that question was, how much power do athletes really have if you lose everything by opening your mouth? Do you really have power if you risk being blackballed for speaking up? So I was really starting to wonder about that. So what I wanted to do in that chapter was to sort of recenter the protest and just remind myself and remind the readers that all of these protests start with the people. They didn't start with the players. They didn't start with, Colin Kaepernick didn't start this. The athletes were responding to what was happening in the street. And so I wanted to talk about labor. I wanted to talk about teachers. I wanted to talk about the average everyday people. And we're seeing it right now in the wake of George Floyd. I think that what's happening in the world right now, the players aren't doing this. The players were responding to what we saw in Minneapolis and what we saw in New York and what we saw in DC. And then the players come forward and then they amplify what the people are doing with their visibility. And so I do think that I think anytime you have people mobilizing, you're going to see some change. And I think certainly if you go back and look at where we were in May to where we are now, you had people that were protesting even last year going, they don't quite understand why this moment was the flashpoint moment, but certainly the world feels differently. And I think that the players have made a bargain with themselves that they are finally going to do something that they hadn't done before, which was to be unified. Remember, when Colin Kaepernick took his knee in 2016, he had some players follow him. He didn't have a lot of players following him. Bruce Maxwell took a knee in Major League Baseball in 2017. He was the only player who took a knee. And I remember speaking to Bruce a few weeks ago, when now all of Major League Baseball is taking a knee, and even the management is out there talking about this. And you go to the Red Sox, you look at Fenway Park, and it says Black Lives Matter out in center field. And Bruce Maxwell calls me and he says, where was this 3 years ago? Why now? Why are people being involved in this in a way where they weren't previously? So clearly the culture is moving, things are shifting, and let's not forget, the players can't solve all the issues, obviously, but they are the visible ones. They're the ones that people pay a lot of attention to. And it can be controversial at times because I think people want their sports. But at the same time, when you look at it from a Black athlete standpoint, I always say that the Black athlete is the most visible and most influential Black employee this country has ever produced. People pay attention to them.
Yeah, no, you're right. Thank you. Thank you. I have to be honest, I'm not a huge sports fan.
How did you survive in Boston? Not a huge sports fan.
I know, right? I know. Everyone always asks me that. And I don't know. I'll watch it, here and there, but I'm not like glued to it. And honestly, if I'm very honest, like the Patriots, I kind of jump on the bandwagon when it's like the playoffs, and I'm like, oh, go, yeah, we're always gonna win, type thing. So I'm not a huge sports fan, but I do, watch and follow it here and there. I get my tidbits of it. What I wanted to ask you is, do you think that this is, we've been hearing a lot in the bookstore about, is it a movement, or is, we just like in the moment right now?
Yep.
Do you think that this, or what do you think about that? Do you think like this is this movement is gonna continue, or are we just in this feel good moment because of the wake of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and just like all that's going on, that it's gonna kind of like die down, and then it's gonna be like back to square one again?
Well, it is a good question, and we'll see what's going to happen. I do feel like there's a feeling that people wonder if this is simply performative, and that everyone wants to be on the right side of the issue and nobody wants to look like they're unfeeling. But I do feel like there's something different about this in two respects. I think the first one is, I think every era, every generation has its enough is enough moment. And I think that obviously we all remember, even if we weren't there, the Emmett Till was enough is enough. That was the enough is enough moment that started in a lot of ways, it's the modern civil rights movement. We know that today is the anniversary of the 4 little girls being killed in Birmingham at the 16th Street Baptist Church. That was the enough is enough moment that got the legislatures and the Congress moving on civil rights legislation. And that it was just, even for people who may have disagreed, you don't do that, right? That there was a moment where people where their decency, they got checked by their own decency. And I think that the combination of COVID and the number of these videos that we've seen and the amount of protests that we've seen, and the fact that people have been cooped up in the house with the pandemic for all this time, so everyone's metabolism is slowed down. I think George Floyd was one of those enough is enough moments. And I think because you are seeing people react in a way, and especially in the sports world, you're seeing them react in ways that they hadn't reacted. I think if you told them last year, in a year from now, the NFL will have end racism in the end zone, people would laugh at you. If you said that the NBA would be, painting Black Lives Matter on the basketball court, they wouldn't believe you, because especially football has been the most unambiguous industry in the country in terms of how it felt about Black protest. So obviously you do wonder, okay, we see these performances, but then what actually changes? That's part of the question. Let's look and see who does the hiring. Let's see who gets jobs. Let's see how things change. Let's see what the reaction is. Let's also see what happens in terms of the white mainstream, how they react, because you always know there's going to be a backlash when something happens. You're already hearing people say, oh, well, if the players take a knee, I'm not going to show up. And so we'll see what the ratings are and see how everybody reacts to this. My feeling has been that at some point things change and that change becomes your normal. And then people start to get used to it. I tend to think that is what's going to happen here. You start moving the bar in a slow, in a slow direction. But today is not yesterday. Um, we've had, last week was the 19th anniversary of September 11th, and we saw what happened. I wrote about this in my book, The Heritage. We saw what happened to sports and what happened to the culture in the wake of 9/11. The culture changed completely into this politics of patriotism. And I think today, post COVID and post George Floyd, we're in a new era. And I think you're now moving into this politics of policing. And I think you're going to see a lot of backlash, and you're seeing a lot of negotiation take place right now. Like when you watch a sporting event, you hear the broadcasters talk about social justice, and you hear this phrase, social justice, social justice. It's not social justice, it's police. It really is a one issue protest, right? What they're really talking about is policing. And they've been talking about policing since Colin Kaepernick. But the broadcasters and the sports industry has a very difficult time saying the word police because they don't want to be in direct opposition with law enforcement. But it's going to be very, very difficult to go back to a sports world where you have athletes openly, actively talking about police and accountability and justice while at the same time having law enforcement appreciation nights at Fenway Park. So somewhere along the line, this is the dynamic is going to change. What is it going to change into? That's a great question. And I think that is one of the things where we'll find out what this business model is going to be for sports. Are they going to have all of these dueling slogans that sort of collide with each other? Or are we going to move into a place where you have more police reform and accountability, where these protests will become less necessary because you start to get more justice?
That's right. I hear you. Absolutely. You mentioned policing. I know there's a chapter in your book about the propaganda. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Well, I think this is a good time to talk about that, because as we talk about this issue in sports, that the protest it really is a one issue protest. And when you see how many more, what does how many more mean? It's how many more of us are going to be killed by police. That's really what it is. When it says, say their names, what are their names? Their names are the people who were killed by police. So once again, the propaganda chapter was all about the tilting of justice toward law enforcement in our popular culture. And when you think about where do we get our information from about police, when you look at the studies done about how people learn about police, or what are their views, how are their views of police shaped, it's from television. It's from television, it's from movies, it's from the popular culture, it's from going to the ballpark. And when you think about these things, if you go to Boston Garden and there's a law enforcement appreciation night essentially telling you to honor police, that doesn't mean disrespect police. That means honor police. Very different thing. To me, I like to think police should be in the background, neither honored nor dishonored. It's a job, it's an important job, it's a hard job, but it's not necessarily something that you outwardly celebrate like it's part of a ball team, like with the NYPD caps and everything else. And the part of this, the reason why I bring this up is because this celebration of police is, as an industry, to make an entire industry heroic. Individuals are heroic, but an industry, but a job isn't inherently heroic just because you have it. These celebrations and all of this sort of propaganda in the popular culture has real deleterious effects, because this is where your juries come from. When you get called into jury duty and you go in, your view of law enforcement is being shaped by these things. How are you going to go to law enforcement appreciation night at the ballpark, and then maybe the next day you've got jury duty and there's a policeman on trial? It's shaping how we treat law enforcement. And so it's not a surprise why there's not that much accountability. So the chapter was really all about that relationship between how police are positioned in our culture, especially post 9/11, and also the difference between how police are viewed in the Black community against how they're viewed in the mainstream, and how when you think about it, there's a great book, the late Noel Ignatieff wrote, How the Irish Became White. I butchered his last name. And it really is in a lot of ways of how law enforcement was one of the occupations that really built the white and immigrant middle class. The Polish and the Italians and the Irish, especially in our town in Boston, have a very different relationship with law enforcement than we do. And so when you talk to a lot of white people, they can tell you about essentially how police built their families. My grandfather was a cop, my father was a cop, I'm a cop, my son's. So you have this legacy generational relationship with police that really does change that dynamic, as opposed to Black and brown communities where the relationship is not familial. It's very different.
Good. Well, I want to take it back a little bit. I know you grew up in Dorchester, and I know in your chapter, The Lost Tribe of Integration, you talk about the METCO program, and I know Leonard had a question for you in regards to like METCO and your thoughts and feelings on that program that's still around.
Right. Yeah, because we have two daughters that graduated through the METCO program. They were in Situate. And you talk about it, the METCO program in your book, and you said you were saddened about an anniversary that the METCO program hadn't become obsolete. You wondered how do we make programs like METCO truly unnecessary? How can we effectively pump money into schools in predominantly Black neighborhoods on Black terms? How do we get our own school systems?
Yeah, no question. Well, I grew up in Dorchester, down Blue Hill Ave off on Ashton Street, down right between Franklin Field and Mattapan, and actually way more on the Franklin Field side. And I remember when we were kids, we were METCO. My sister went to Spalding Elementary in Newton, and I went to Beethoven Elementary in Waban. And you you're old when your school doesn't even exist anymore. I think they renamed it, but I still call it Beethoven Elementary. And when you think back to those days, to me, the point of that chapter had been this theme that I had been developing in my mind about why it was so important to take Black people away from Black communities, and why, when I think about the arc of my own life, what is the one constant? It had always been to pull you away from your own people for the sake of better. And that conversation really bothers me. Why do I have to get away from us to get better? Why are we always pulled away from where we come from for the purpose of education? And so that was the case in the 70s when we were in Dorchester, and we moved out of Dorchester to go to school in Plymouth, even though it wasn't like the schools were any better down there, but it was safer. So once again, you were trading physical harm in Dorchester for emotional harm when we got to Plymouth. But the thing that I had noticed most about METCO in going out there was the communities themselves. And getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning to take the bus out there, and then being out there and realizing just what those communities, how much more affluent those communities were, how much more education was the focus. Even as a little kid, they just had better. And I remember I was 7, 8 years old, you'd come home, you'd leave Waban and you'd come home to Dorchester, and you'd look and it had really serious effects on what you thought you were worth. And at the same time, I remember, because this was also happening during busing, I remember the battles that were taking place in my family. One half of the family wanted to keep everybody in the city and stay in Mattapan and stay around Black people. And I remember my family thinking that from a safety standpoint, they just didn't want to risk their children being in danger all the time. And what was the price of that? And the price had always been to be pulled away from your own people. And that's why it was referred to as the lost tribe, is that what did it mean to constantly be the only Black child in class? I remember having this conversation on another interview I did a few months ago, I'd realized I did not have my first Black male teacher until freshman year of college at Temple University. And there are so many studies that show the effects, and education studies of the effects of having a teacher, having instructors who look like you or who have the same or similar experience as you, and what that actually does to Black children. I just really wanted to examine that and to look and to really see that there's a certain through line. The part of the book says, the first sentence of the whole book is, to be Black is to be a dissident. And what that means is that you are constantly trying to figure out where you fit and how do you defend who you are and be that person of substance that we're all trying to develop ourselves into being, while at the same time recognizing that virtually everything in the society is geared against your development as a group. So individually, you're trying to find ways to improve, but as a group, we are constantly trying to advocate for ourselves. And that advocacy comes at such a huge price. I think in the next chapter, I'm sure we'll talk about that in the next chapter, which was called The Worst Thing in the World. It was an extension of that, which is, why is it that Black advocacy comes at such a heavy cost? Why is it people say, oh, well, with Colin Kaepernick or the athletes or whatever, you're going to lose your career. Why is that the construction? So from the Lost Tribe, the construction was, why do you need to be pulled away from your own people to have a better life? And then as we move forward in that section of the essays, it was, why is advocating for people who have some of the worst economic situations, why is that a career death sentence?
Let me ask you, did you take part in the host family?
It's really funny about that letter. It's like, this is a sore spot for me. I'm telling you, you're hurting me right now.
I don't mean to hurt you.
No, and the reason is because I didn't even know I was part of the host family. We were all part of the host family program. I thought I actually had friends. And then I realized that my sister was like, no, because there was one family that we used to go to every, I think, once a week or twice a month or somewhere in there. And I remember going to their house in Newton, and I remember it was the first time I'd ever seen one of those jungle gym backyards with the swing and the slide and everything in the backyard. And I remember that vividly, and I didn't realize it until I went back and did some research on the program, that was clearly the host program, that was being part of the host program. I was like, oh man, I thought I was invited over because, we were friends, but maybe we were friends, but at the time, I had no idea that the host program existed because we were little kids. We left in the 3rd grade. So that part was kept from me, but yes, we were part of it.
Okay. All right. You mentioned, in the chapter, The Worst Thing in the World, you focus on, the choices that the athletes have made. And, some of them, like OJ, they downplay their Blackness. Whereas we have, athletes now really truly embracing their Blackness. And, even on the Celtics, we have Jaylen Brown, who is, doing that opposite, that thing. He's embracing his Blackness. What do you make of all of that?
Well, I think it's fascinating. The root of that chapter is that there's a through line that comes out of the civil rights movement. And that through line, once the players started to make money and once the players had access to the finer things, which is to simply say integration, just to buy a house wherever you wanted to buy a house. And then of course the money that would come with that later on, then they would start to become really, really wealthy, was this idea of getting away from that. Sports, we talk about sports being the meritocracy, and that sports is the outside of the military. You look at, there are very few industries that are as integrated as sports. Basketball is not even integrated. Basketball is 80% Black, so it's barely integrated, except off the field it is, but on the court it really isn't. But yet there's this through line that runs through, whether it's from OJ to Michael Jordan to Tiger Woods to today, where you constantly have these athletes who are faced with this choice of either embracing or distancing themselves from being Black. And the interesting, I mean, even someone like Michael Jordan, who has no ambiguity at all about his Blackness. Michael Jordan doesn't have any confusion about his race. Michael Jordan just chooses not to engage, very different from the Tiger Woods situation. And I think the point that I was trying to make in that chapter was, you can be whatever you want to be. You can choose to engage in this. You can choose not to engage in this, but do not tell me that a choice isn't being made. And the choice that's being made is the choice that your industry is demanding of you. They're essentially telling you in so many ways not to embrace who you are and not to embrace where you come from, because it is career suicide. That if you speak too much or if you advocate, I remember talking to Chris Webber, the basketball player, about this. And he was telling me when he first got into the NBA that even the Black players were telling him, do not have a Black agent, because the white owners and the white general managers will believe that that's a sign of being militant. And he's like, I'm not being militant. I'm just trying to give someone an opportunity. So you can see sort of the dynamic of the worst thing in the world, that this is something where, you know, the fact that simply advocating for Black people is some sort of risk. And these are the dynamics that I wanted to engage in. Why are we even framing things this way? Why is this so fraught? What is the big deal? And I think that the other part of that chapter was also sort of discussing this idea that, once again, as we discussed earlier, the further away you got away from Black people, the better your life got. The schools were better, they were safer, the healthcare was better. All of this was supposedly better, and it's an incredibly tough place to be. And I remember being very upset with a lot of colleagues, especially, you know, you're talking about colleagues who are really starting to reach the tops of their professions, whether it's the doctors, the lawyers, the architects, the writers, whomever. And the number of times that they would say things to me such as, well, I don't want to be a Black writer. I just want to be a writer who happens to be Black. And that would just enrage me. And I'm like, who talks like that other than us? Nobody talks about themselves like that except us. And that this constant negotiation, and that's what I mean by to be Black is to be a dissident. You're constantly trying to navigate this place. And sometimes to no avail, which is why the last chapter is called Renters, that even at the end of the day, did you succeed? Are you able to actually be yourself, or are you constantly trying to downplay this most central part of you? And how do you find your way through that and be able to look in the mirror?
Well, in the chapter, The Mediocre White Boy, you write that white reporters who are stand-in your profession for those in others are uncomfortable with accountability. And so few Black people get reporting jobs, especially Black women. How do we change that?
Yeah, exactly. And that is the question. To me, it always comes down to the same thing. Who's getting jobs here? And as we talk about all of these different pathologies that take place, so much of it comes down to who's getting an opportunity, and who gets an opportunity for wealth, and who gets an opportunity to just to be. And you asked me, Clarissa, earlier about, is this performative? Is this moment performative? Is it a moment? Is it a moment, or is it a movement? This is where we're going to find out who is in charge. If it so turns out, and I feel badly, and I say this often about this new generation. When we were growing up, my parents never told us that equality was an option. We never thought about equality. They always told us, you're Black, you got to be 3 times as good. You got to be twice as good. That the goal wasn't to be them. The goal was to have an opportunity. This generation, they want both. This generation wants, we're just as good as everybody else. We want equality and we want access. My generation, it was just all about access. And I don't know how to get there. I don't know if it's possible numerically to get to have full equality when you're 13% of the population. That math doesn't really work. In that chapter, The Mediocre White Boy, one of the reasons why I titled that chapter as it was the frustrations that I had and I'm sure so many women in the industry know exactly what I'm talking about as well. It's this concept that I refer to as the assumption of competence, that on the one hand, when you get your job, when you don't get your job, you're draining the system. And then when you get hired, they refer to you as an affirmative action hire. So you're never, we talk about merit all the time, but when you're in the room, they don't really believe that you belong there, but they never question their own competence. And I have been surrounded, as we all have, by mediocre people, mediocre black boys, mediocre white boys, but mostly mediocre white boys, because they've populated in the newsroom. The newsroom is 87% white when I first got into the business, 90% white. And so the question for me had been, once again, that question of navigation, of how to figure out the different ways to manage when you know that everything you do, when you succeed, it's because you were handed something. When you don't succeed, it's because you're lazy and you're shiftless and you're not motivated. And it makes you feel like you cannot win. And I've had a great career. And so I look at it as something inside of you. You have to be the one to figure out how to navigate this. You need new strategies. You need new tactics, because the dynamic around you isn't changing. Hopefully this moment that we're in is going to change the dynamics. And even if it doesn't change perceptions, at the very least, let it change numbers. It reminds me of the great Negro League coach Buck O'Neill, who used to work with the Royals all those years before he passed. One of my all-time favorite people. I'd sit down with Buck, and Buck would always say that the key to being black in this country is very simple. Give me the chance, and I'll do the rest. And I always carried that with me, because that was, to me, the goal. The goal wasn't equality. It was just access. And if you give me the opportunity to do something, then it's on me to do something with it.
Awesome. Actually, you touched a little bit on, I was going to ask you, my next question was, what would you say to young, aspiring, like journalists of color, as they navigate in this world, as they, try to, find themselves in that profession? Like, what advice would you give them to encourage them, or to, motivate them to, to keep on keeping on?
Yeah, well, it's terrible advice, but still good advice. You just got to grind. You got to grind. You got to fight. You got to fight for your space. The attitude that I always tell everybody is, at some point in your life, bet on yourself, that the world is full of obstacles. You can't be one of them. You've got to be your own biggest advocate. You have to believe that you've got something to say, that you've got to have something to contribute, but you also have to put in the work to do it. And they're not, they're not false equivalencies. They're not one against the other. It's both. It's always both. And I feel like the numbers are stacked against. There's no sugarcoating it. There's no hiding it. The business is shrinking. The industry itself is shrinking for everybody. And if it's hurting everybody, it's hurting us even worse. But I always still feel like, if you have something of value, you have something to offer, you have to really, really fight hard for it. And you got to fight harder than ever for it now. And I think that it's, like I said, it's not great advice, but it's the only advice I have. Because when I think about me, when I wanted to get into the business was shrinking then, and it's way smaller now than it was then. So I think that the real key is to grind really hard, and to concentrate really hard, and to not be afraid to connect with people. It's not just who you know, but if you don't have advocates, if you don't have people who are interested in your success is an incredibly difficult thing to achieve.
No, I think I love it. I think it's honest. And that's what they need to hear, right? I think not all of this young generation, things are like sugar coated, but they need to hear, right? You got to be on your grind. You have to work hard. We have a 19-year-old at home who her generation, right, where she wants, but that putting work is like, it's not so much there. And we are those type of parents who, and probably more so Leonard, because he'll say I'm more lenient. But just, giving them the information and letting them know. And because this world is, this world is not easy out there, and you got to know, like, yeah, we want you to be inspired and motivated, but we also need you to be realistic.
Yeah, no doubt. And but I also try to give people credit too. I mean, by the time I got into the business, I remember my uncle used to say to me, when I looked at you, I just used to look at you laying around the couch and playing video games and dribbling that basketball, and I used to think, there goes the laziest SOB I'd ever seen in my life, but you turned out all right. I'm like, thanks. So they surprise us.
Yeah, they do.
Yeah, they do.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you put it, it was pointed, you said it, you just have to grind. It's a lot of work. You just have to put the work in.
Yeah, no question.
All right.
I talking your ear off, or
No, you're not. No, if you want to, add anything, you can keep on going before we open up the floor, to the audience questions. We want to remind the audience that we do have a Q&A box. So if you do have any questions, please submit your questions in our Q&A box. But no, Howard, you can absolutely,
No. I always feel bad when I go on too long. So if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Okay. I think we do have a question. Our Beacon Press is our sponsor and publisher of Howard's book. So we want to, again, thank Beacon Press and Boston Book Club. So Howard, what are your thoughts about the NFL using the Black national anthem and having a moment?
Well, I thought that the Red Sox did the same thing on opening day in July. And so I think they're all good gestures. I'm not going to argue it. I'm not upset with it. And I think that things move. And I think that I'm not going to be too mad about any of it. And if they fire every Black coach next year and nobody gets more opportunity, then you come back and we revisit all of this. But I'm very distrustful of the NFL anyway as an industry, because they were so clear. You can make an argument that all of this is their fault in a way. I mean, think about it. 4 years ago, if they had left Colin Kaepernick alone, and if the teams the next year had just signed him, if they hadn't blackballed him, it's a totally different national conversation anyway. So the NFL doesn't really just get off the hook because, they can play Lift Every Voice and Sing.
Okay, awesome. We do have some questions from the audience. I want to read the first one. So the first question, or the second question rather, is from Elizabeth. Elizabeth asks, are you hopeful that change is happening?
Yeah, I'm hopeful about it from the standpoint of the fact that things are moving in a certain direction and that there's an opportunity to do it. We'll see what happens. Anyone that follows American history knows that this isn't the first time there's been an opportunity for the country to move in a given direction. And we always know there's been a backlash. So to me, the question is going to be, what do we do with this moment? What is going to happen with it? Obviously, everybody is looking to see what happens in November. That's a big deal. I think also we'll find out as well, that battle that takes place in terms of how much tolerance and stamina do people have for, and white people especially, do they have for the fact that nobody's really asking for anything more other than a certain level of equality, but it seems like they're being put upon when they really aren't. It's this, and we're starting to see it in the numbers now, saying that support for, racial justice is declining after like 6 weeks or whatever. And so I'm always skeptical because I know my history, but I don't want to be curmudgeonly about it. And I don't want to be pessimistic about it. To me, my attitude has been I do feel like so much of what's taking place right now is white people talking to other white people. And if those conversations have to be had, then let them have it, and we'll see what they do with it. But I feel like, my son and I have this conversation all the time when he wanted to go out and protest and he wanted to go out in the street. And I was like, I'm not sure how much of this fight is yours. And I said, because we're not asking for anything more than to be left alone. So if they have to have this conversation to reach a better place, and there's areas there where you feel like, okay, there's an opportunity where yesterday is, where today is different from yesterday, I'm not going to be pessimistic about it.
Okay. Could you describe the qualities of the best white ally you've ever known?
Well, there's been a lot. There have been a lot of people, as I've said. One of the things in the book, in Full Dissidence, that I harp on a lot, and for people who read it, there's this phrase that I hate more than anything in the world, and I don't like superlatives, but I may hate this phrase the most, and it is self-made. Nobody is self-made. Nobody is self-made. Everybody got help. Somebody helped you along the line, helped you be something, helped you be whatever you would turn out to be. I think for me, I remember, just there are plenty of people who had your back. There are plenty of people who supported you. I still think I go back journalistically, professionally, to a man that I'd met when I was an intern at the Lancaster Sunday News. And he had said to me, Bill, a sports editor, and he had said to me, once again, to focus on the people who take an interest in you, that we spend so much time concentrating on all the people who we're not sure like us or who don't support us, and we reinforce ourselves with negativity. But if you can find a way to concentrate on the people who take an interest in your success, then you'll be much, much better off mentally. You'll be much, much better off emotionally. You'll have so much more opportunities to see things more objectively, and that's including the things where you're not doing as well, where you failed. So that was back in 1991. Always grateful for that advice.
We have a live question.
Mm-hmm.
This is from Jennifer. She says, I am a white teacher in Newton and teach the civil rights movement. How would you suggest I balance amplifying the voices of my Black students while not spotlighting or tokenizing them?
Yeah, it's a hard question. And I remember at least the civil rights movement is being taught. I think that's progress. When we were growing up, I remember in 7th grade up at Plymouth Carver Intermediate School, I think they threw us in a room and we watched Roots, and that was it. And that's not even the civil rights movement. That was like TV day. And imagine being the only Black kid in class having to watch Roots in 1981. So I think that to me, the best way to do these types of questions, and when I worked on my Hank Aaron book, The Last Hero, instead of concentrating on all the Black players, on what it meant to be Black, and that so much breaks down how we discuss race, go ask the Black guy and go ask the Black woman how it went for them. I always focus on everybody and ask them their own, ask them the same questions. What were your introductions to the world around you? What did you see? How do you see things? And really personalize it to make the white students know that this is their fight too. And I think part of this battle that we have when we talk about sports and we talk about civil rights in general is everyone treats it like it's a Black problem. It's not a Black problem. It's a problem. And I think that by emphasizing that this is something that belongs to everybody is usually the first step. And also for the Black kids out there to make sure that it's okay for them not to know every single thing, and for them to be able to learn as well and to be able to express themselves. And demographically, it is a different conversation when you're in a classroom of 25 kids and 22 of them are black, and very, very different if you're the only one or if there's a handful of you in there. So you have to sort of be mindful of the subject matter can be very, very difficult when you're isolated like that too.
Yeah. That's true.
Well, here's another question from Peter. I'm a privileged white man in the suburbs. What can I do to help fight structural racism?
To me, that question has always been better for the people who create the structure and the people who maintain the structure. I think that I think the acknowledgement that there is a structure is always a first step. This goes back to this idea of self-made. When you hear, how many white people do you hear say, well, nobody gave me anything. Well, no one was taking anything away from you either. So these types of conversations, it does go back to this idea of how much education we're willing to have and how much conversation we want to have with each other. I think, to me, it's important not to be so defensive. And I think about this too, because who wants to be the one who gets battered all the time on these issues? Nobody wants to be the bad guy, right? Which is why whenever you watch these films and movies and everything else, we're trying to find something redeeming. Who wants to go pay $15 for your movie ticket and to get beaten over the head with what a terrible, horrible person you are? But at the same time, there's a lot of terrible, horrible history out there. So I think that one of the biggest issues is to, I look at it this way. We live in a very civilized society, supposedly. We all know the difference between right and wrong. We all know the very basic principles. There's no magic formula out there. I think listening and paying attention and recognizing the experiences is different than yours necessarily. And I think that it's always important to recognize as well that that we have ears to listen. And I think that we spend a lot of time talking, and maybe we should all just do a little bit more listening.
I agree.
And there's also a connection. Oh, I think sometimes people believe, like for me, like someone says, okay, what is full dissidence? I mean, to me, it's illumination. It was me recognizing that I don't have to have these conversations, that I don't have to change your mind. I mean, I am extremely appreciative, and I really love the work, a lot of the anti-racism work that people do. This is not that. This Full Dissidence is not a self-help book. The book is really, the motto for the book as I was writing it was, I'm not trying to change your mind. This is simply my life as I see it. And I think having an understanding that we have different starting places and that those starting places are not all legitimate starting places. I think it helps a lot, but I think people spend a lot of time trying to defend their space. And when that happens, real conversation falls apart.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to read a question from the chat box. So we have Mira. She says, you discuss policing as the glue of whiteness and the enforcement arm of whiteness. With those principles in mind and whiteness being a key element of policing, what is your position on how policing should be reformed and the defund/abolish the police movement?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I feel like I am of the mind that the defund movement is a powerful one and it's an important one. And I feel like I was always of two minds on it. Sometimes I felt like, well, the terminology is going to turn people off. But then again, I felt like, you know what? No, deal with the terminology because it's actually in some ways accurate, that it's a reallocation. Defund sounds way more direct than reallocate, right? So I'm okay with that. The concept of the glue of whiteness is a really difficult one because what we're really talking about is, you look at the Gallup numbers, look at the poll numbers, the relationship between police, confidence in police, just as a simple question. The numbers are so stark between black and white because the relationship is so different. And this is one of the areas where you really run into problems because the post 9/11 edict of if you see something, say something if you live in a culture that's already afraid of Black people, who does that put in danger? And we saw that this summer. It wasn't just George Floyd, and it wasn't just Ahmaud Arbery, and it wasn't just Breonna Taylor. It was also Amy Cooper in Central Park calling the police on the Black guy who was bird watching in Central Park. This idea that police are not only going to protect me, but I can use them at my disposal to hurt you if I need to. And this idea as well, once again, that there's a personal nature, there's a personal relationship to police that a lot of Black people don't have because we don't have the legacy. You know, the industry of policing literally put food on the table for many, many white people. So that relationship is so different than it is for Black people. So to me, I feel like one of the things that really has to happen is there has to be some form of demystification here of that industry. There has to be some, I think the focus really needs to go on, you know, legislatively and following the law in terms of accountability. I think the law has a lot to do with this. I think attitudes absolutely have to change, because if juries aren't going to convict police officers, you're never going to get the accountability. Let's not forget that if these officers who have done these things, if they didn't also walk away and then get new jobs, I think the national conversation is also different. So it's not just the fact that these Black people are being shot when they have encounters with police. It's also that the police are getting away with it. What did Colin Kaepernick say? That they're killing Black people and getting paid vacations. So the accountability part of this is huge. And that's the area where I think a lot of people pay attention to. Black people have they have no problems with justice. They want justice just like everybody else. But the real slap in the face isn't just attending the funeral. It's to watch these people also then receive new jobs and promotions and acquittals.
It's powerful. You're absolutely right. All right. Yeah, we have Kaisha here. So Kaisha asks, she says, earlier this year, the city of Boston declared racism as a public health emergency. In your opinion, what is the most immediate tangible action in the context of full dissidence as a native Bostonian that Boston can take to show how serious the city is about this declaration?
Well, one, the declaration is an accurate one, because there's a level of exhaustion that's taking place here. And I think anytime you talk to Black people, on the one hand, you have plenty of white people who mean really well. They're well-meaning on this, and they want to know what they can do to be better people and what we can do to be better in the society. And then they start to look at themselves and wonder, what's my role in this? All of this is important. All of this is real. All of this is helpful. It's also incredibly taxing. It's also incredibly exhausting, because we got to live this. And this is on the one hand, the conversations have to be had. On the other hand, I don't really want to have them anymore. So it's a tough place to be. But to the point, absolutely, it is a real thing. And I think that the hard part in a place like Boston is we love the fact that we're exceptional. We always tell people we're exceptional. Our nickname is that we're exceptional. We're the hub. The hub of what? The hub of the universe. That's kind of an ego trip right there, right? But then when it comes to race, we like to say, oh, we're just like everybody else. We're not as, wait a minute. Well, if you're exceptional, then you got to own that exceptionalism. And we have had an exceptional racial history here. So once again, that defensiveness has to go away. And it is the toughest area with all this, and where I have my biggest amount of despair is, how do you remedy an issue when you don't have the political numbers to remedy that issue, right? When you think about Boston, what is the first thing you think about when you think about political capital in Boston? You think about the Irish. You think about raw numbers. At least that's what I think about. You think about the fact that the Brahmins had the money, they controlled the vault, but the Irish controlled the politics because they had the numbers. And the Black and brown in Boston don't have the numbers to really affect the type of change that you can get in other places. So once again, there's a battle that has to take place. There's a level of allyship that has to take place. But mostly when it comes to Boston, it is, to me, a question of a lack of defensiveness and reflection. And Boston has got to own some of this. And the hardest thing about racism in this country to me has always been that the United States doesn't want to own anything. I mean, there's always been two sort of ways to talk about race in my lifetime. It's always been things are better than they were or get over it. And neither one of those really helps moving things forward.
All right. Well said. Well said. All right. I know we have just a few more, just a couple more minutes. I just want to read our last question here from PJ. PJ said, Mr. Bryant, when I finish The Warmth of Other Suns, your book is next. He says, thank you and keep writing. I'm a member of the brand new North Shore branch of the NAACP. Wonderful and revealing conversation this evening. I particularly like your comment that a job is not inherently heroic just because you have it. That is why some police act like they are on a pedestal. So this was actually just more of a comment, actually. So thank you, PJ, for
no
that.
pressure. I want to be after that one.
Right. Okay.
One more?
Yeah, let's see. What else do we have? Let's see. Hold on. Okay, we have one from Helene. She asks, how has COVID changed the protest movement in the sports arena?
Well, I think I know that one. That's Helen. That is the publisher of Beacon Press, right, Helen? So thank you, Helen. I will say I think it's been a perfect storm. I think that COVID has had a lot to do with the activism. I think COVID has had a lot to do with the opportunity, the combination, this perfect storm, once again, of Minneapolis and COVID. Do the Milwaukee Bucks actually walk out on a basketball game if there are 20,000 fans waiting for them to come out and play? Much different conversation when these stadiums were empty. I think that the players, I think that the leagues sort of have recognized as well that this, I don't want to call it completely a throwaway season, but I think they know that everything's going to be sort of unorthodox. I think that there was to the woman's question earlier about race and mental health. I think as the numbers started to come out about the disproportionate number of African Americans affected by COVID, and combined with what was happening with George Floyd, really raised the consciousness of a lot of the athletes and made them think, should we go back out and play? And I really do believe that these two elements together, what happened with George Floyd and the pandemic, they can't be decoupled. I think they have a lot to do with each other, and I think we're in a very, very different place. Does Major League Baseball do what it did? Do Red Sox do what they do if there are 40,000 or 38,000 fans in the, at Fenway Park? Do they react differently? And how does the public react? So there's no question that as we think about this as a topic, and as we think about it as history, that the pandemic and the racial issues go completely side by side. You can't talk about one without the other.
All right. So I think my last just really question is, what would be, for someone who may have not had, have read your book, Full Dissidence, what's your takeaway? Like, what do you want people to know or to learn about, this book? Like, what's the big takeaway that you want people to have from reading your book?
I want people to pay attention. I want people to pay attention to where this country is going. It really is. The book's not really about sports or about race. It's about everything. It's about where we are as a people. Do these values actually matter? I mean, to me, the thing that I think about so much is I don't follow people, we follow values. Do we still follow values in this country? And part of the thing that we didn't talk about, which is the second half of the book, is really all about the rise of the celebrity culture. We were talking about this the other day, how tired I am of the billionaire class that we're in right now as well, that we look at LeBron James to build schools for us, and we look at Jay-Z and Kevin Durant and Beyonce to put our kids through school. And all of these different things are all coming together as a culture, and they're asking real questions of us. They're asking us questions that I think that we always felt didn't need to be answered, that they answered themselves. But this combination, and now adding the pandemic to it as well, we're in a real place where we have to look in the mirror and we have to ask ourselves, who are we? And I did that in writing the book, and I think it's a reflective question as well for everybody reading it.
You want to have anything else last to say?
No, he answered.
Well, this was wonderful.
It was great.
This is a great discussion. I definitely think that, this conversation needs to keep going on more platforms. It needs to be had more. So I just want to thank you, Howard Bryant, fellow Bostonian, Dorchester, native. But thank you so much. You definitely, shed a lot of light on your book, and what's going on. Like you said, it's not just about sports. It's not just about racism. It's just about everything that's going on. So thank you for sharing that with all of us. And we want to thank our audience for all of your questions. We thank Beacon Press, and we thank Boston.com Book Club. And until we meet again, on behalf of Frugal Bookstore, we thank you all. And you guys can, purchase Howard's book, Full Dissidence. We actually sold out, Howard, so that our last copy that we have in the store, but we have some more in order. But everyone, please come and go to our website, come to our store, and purchase Howard's book. So thank you all, and have a great night, and be well and stay safe.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to seeing you all in person when the time